Good morning and welcome to this week's Computing Colloquium. I'm Curtis Cantley. I'm mainly in electrical and computer engineering, so that's why many of you might not recognize me, but I'm also affiliate faculty here in computing. So it's my pleasure today to welcome Dr. Tej Pandit. Tej is an AI research scientist now at the Matrix AI Consortium at UT San Antonio, and he's focused on designing and establishing open access, large-scale, heterogeneous neuromorphic hardware ecosystems, particularly for the Thor Neuromorphic Commons project. And that's an initiative that basically stems from a Nature publication on which he's a co-author. He earned his Ph.D. in electrical engineering from UTSA and his master's from Rochester Institute of Technology. And basically his research delves into neuromorphic systems to create AI with more natural and continual learning capabilities. So of course it's well aligned with my group and several others here at Boise State. And we're excited to have him here to give the talk this morning. So
likewise. Hello guys, good morning. And my name is Tej, as he introduced. I'm going to be talking about neuromorphic computing at scale. I'll be covering quite a few different approaches for neuromorphic computing from an algorithmic standpoint, and I'll likely touch upon some of the hardware at the end. The presentation was tailored towards students, but I'm glad so many faculty are attending as well. We'll start right now. So just really short background. You are all familiar with AI and the rise of AI that has been taking place over the last couple of decades. But more importantly, there's been a significant rise in AI over the last 5 years. And not only has there been development from the industrial standpoint, but also a boom from an academic standpoint, as people have realized how useful AI is as a tool to aid in research and development. So, as we know, the significant boom took place what is called the ChatGPT boom or the ChatGPT moment. Well, this is probably when Google started tracking data, and this is the trend of AI as a search term over time. And you can see that's probably where I joined the field, and clearly someone did not like it, so there's been a small dip after that. But then you notice ChatGPT came out, and there was a sudden boom. And I think that this transition was made because ChatGPT is one of the first large language models which made it more accessible for the wider audience to search, not just the AI enthusiasts and researchers. So it allowed us to communicate with these models using plain language, which almost everyone's familiar with. And that brings us to today, and it's at an all-time peak. Some call it a bubble. You'll find out soon enough. But one of the things is that we've seen these large language models grow over time, and we have quite a few of them from different companies. What we don't talk about too much, we do talk about their performance and we evaluate them on a day-to-day basis, but we don't really talk too much, or we don't even see the power requirements that go into running these large language models. And I'm going to take some smaller language models as an example. So this is probably the lowest or the smallest system you can get to run one of these small to medium-sized language models, like an RTX 3060 running on a normal processor. And this system will consume about 300 watts of power to run any of these models successfully. Now let's compare this with our biological counterpart, which we are all familiar with. The cortical computation for doing the same or equivalent computation in our brain costs about 0.1 watts and can range to about like 4 or 5 watts maybe. And our brains are able to perform not only the tasks that the large language model performs, but several more tasks, and are able to perform multimodal integration from all our different sensors or senses, and also control our bodies and all the processes inside our bodies at the same time. So how is it able to do all these complex cognitive behaviors while still using considerably less power? That's an open question, actually. I don't have the answer for you today. But what we do is, in neuromorphic computing, we hope to answer that question by actually studying neuroscience and these biological processes, and then trying to replicate them and to see what the resultant behaviors are. Neuroscience won't always give you the answer of what happens. So by recreating these processes, we hope to see whether we can find something new that our AIs can do that we didn't know, and then attribute those to what the same neurological processes do in our brain. So this is a sneak peek into some of the existing neuromorphic systems which are out there and how they have grown over the last few years. So as I pointed out previously, a desktop processor uses about 50 to 100 watts. That's being conservative. Today, these things are running even hotter. Whereas neuromorphic processors run in the order of 1 to 5 watts. And this is because of several different factors, including the way they handle data processing as well as the compute units themselves. So let's get straight into it. Why we consider the brain as an inspiration for lifelong learning and its ability to learn continually over time. So the brain has different regions, and they are all responsible for different activities and different processes, such as attention planning from the frontal lobe, and sensory and visual information processing from the parietal lobe, as well as balance and memory from the temporal lobe, and motor control from cerebellum. We think of the brain as a homogeneous structure because it contains neurons. But if you actually dive deep enough, you'll notice that they also consist of different hierarchies, different types of neurons. And as we try to identify what these different neurons and collections of neurons do, we can actually break down these systems into functional parts. So let's take a look at some of the existing AI models and how they were inspired by different brain topologies and brain mechanisms. So we have this graph is broken up on the x-axis into different methods of AI, and on the y-axis as domains of application you can think of. So we have parts of the brain which have inspired network topologies, such as the region of the neocortex, which inspired HTM. We have the prefrontal cortex, which are deep reinforcement learning networks are based on, and also more recently, attention mechanisms, which are a very key important part of transformers, which are significant to the LLM development. We also have the regions of the brain which have structural plasticity and mechanisms based on structural plasticity, such as neuroevolution. And neuroevolution takes place in young children the most. Thanks for pointing that out. There's also replay and rehearsal, which takes place in the hippocampus. And lastly, there's synaptic plasticity, which I will say takes place all throughout the brain. And this takes place on a synapse level, a very low level process. And there are mechanisms like gating, which is close to something like dropout for normal networks. And then you can have metaplasticity and synaptogenesis to grow more connections, and also neuromodulation. And hopefully we can put together these things to hopefully one day achieve the big AGI term, as well as increase knowledge transfer between these networks, which we have to keep training. So how do neuromorphic systems compare to traditional von Neumann computing systems? Well, the first thing is that traditional von Neumann computing systems use sequential processing. Even if you have GPUs, they're just a bunch of sequential von Neumann processes held in parallel. But the computing themselves is largely sequential. They also have a separate memory and compute units, and most of the code are binary instructions, and largely all the compute is synchronous. That means all of them run on clock edge. On the other side, we have neuromorphic architectures, which are inherently massively parallel. Neuromorphic systems preferably have co-located processing and memory units, such as near memory or in-memory compute. And they also use spikes for most of their data and for their instructions also, you should think of. And lastly, they are largely asynchronous. That means they do not run, all the units operate independently, and all the signals and data are asynchronous. Okay, so let's take a look at these spiking neural networks, which is a large component of neuromorphic computing. So they are largely, one of the foundational pieces is the neuron. The neuron consists of an axon, the cell body, and the dendrites. And several of these neurons come together to form our brain and our cognitive processes. You have your signals which originate from the cell body, pass through your axon, and then are passed from these dendrites onto the next neuron using neurotransmitters. And those neurotransmitters can be acetylcholine and GABA and a couple of other ones, I think, like noradrenaline and epinephrine, I think, if I'm not mistaken. And these neurotransmitters convey different information and also pass these cellular impulses. And this is a largely electrochemical process. So it is only several orders of magnitude slower than normal computers. However, they are also several orders of magnitude more efficient than traditional computers in terms of power. And one of these reasons is because of their spikes. Instead of having these large data bytes or arrays which are transmitted, we use spikes, which are these electrochemical spikes present in the neurons. These are, you can think of them as changing ion potentials in the neuron body, which are passed on and then retransmitted through these neurotransmitters, and then re-engaged and regenerated on the other side in the next neuron. We have different interpretations of a spike. So we have a more biological spike, which is when our neuron potential reaches a particular phase and then it spikes, allowing that neuron potential to decay. We have a more digital spike, which is our interpretation of this in digital electronics. Lastly, the neuron spike propagates from the axon to the dendrites. So a quick look at feed-forward spiking neural networks. I'll be showcasing two basic architectures. If you're familiar with a neural network architecture, it consists of nodes or neurons, and they are connected in layers or not necessarily in layers to the next set of neurons. And these connections are called edges. And the nodes, or you can think of them as synapses, and we express the synapse strength as weights. Spiking networks the only difference here between spiking networks is largely the type of data that's being processed. Instead of packets of data, we have spikes, which are asynchronously processed by these networks. We also have lateral inhibition, which is our equivalent to the not the softmax, which would essentially prevent, it's used in the output layer, which essentially prevents all your neurons from spiking at the same time and forces one neuron to spike and laterally inhibits the other neurons from spiking. As a different mechanism, as a different architecture, we can also have recurrent spiking neural network architectures where the nodes are not only connected from layer to layer, but they're also connected between layers and within layers. This allows for temporal activity to take place and also temporal decoding of these spikes to take place. So if there is any information that takes place across time, this is what we hope that can be decoded by these recurrent architectures. They're also referred to as reservoirs, and Luke has informed me they're also called hairballs. Okay, this was a quick video. I don't think it's necessary since most of you are familiar with traditional neural networks and probably seen them. But this was one of the best visualizations I saw online that actually shows what a neural network actually looks like. This is really well done. This is probably using, everything's running on the MNIST dataset, so they're showing the input as an image and the data class that's being chosen. But what was interesting was when you see this is a normal perceptron, then you have a multi-layered perceptron where it's broken up into layers. It doesn't show the training, I think it's just showing inference at this point. And then you also have your convolutional layers where you're extracting spatial data through convolutional filters. What is very interesting to see is that largely the entire network is active at all points of time when it's processing a particular sample. However, when you see a spiking neural network, you notice that the data propagates from the input all the way to the output. And it's a sparse propagation. That means not all parts of the network are active at all times. This is another reason for this additional efficiency in terms of energy. And I thought this visualization was just really good. It's not mine, it's someone else's. I think it's yeah, I just one I had it this thing yesterday, but okay. Yeah, it's Dennis Dimitriev from Cyber Controls. Okay. Okay, so what I am going to skip is how neural networks work. I think most of you are familiar with neural networks, as I've been told. And since you are familiar with neural networks, we will skip this one. But what I would like to say was most neural networks are trained, these are traditional AI, ANNs, are trained using backpropagation or some sort of gradient learning, where the error is generated and then backpropagated, derive gradients, and then update the weights. What I wanted to talk about was how this occurs in spiking neural networks. There are several ways spiking neural networks work. So one of the most basic ways, or the most biologically inspired ways, is Hebbian learning, where the Hebbian rule generally states that cells that fire together wire together. That generally means that if two neurons are firing in some sort of synchronous manner, they're more likely to strengthen that synaptic connection between them and thereby encourage that coherent behavior in the future as well. What that looks like is the STDP rules, which is spiked time-dependent plasticity. So we have, for example, here you have a presynaptic neuron and a postsynaptic neuron in this example. And if you have your presynaptic spike, that means your presynaptic neuron spikes before the postsynaptic neuron, you get potentiation, where that synaptic connection is strengthened or that weight is increased. On the other side, if you have your presynaptic neuron spike after your postsynaptic neuron, that connection is weakened or the weight is reduced. And this becomes a foundation for local learning, because this takes place between two neurons and you don't need a supervisory body that can actually provide, backpropagation or error between large sets of neurons, because that is largely said to be non-biologically plausible, because we don't have such a system in our brains. We have not discovered this mechanism in the brain where gradients can be computed and passed to different, there's no backward pass in the brain as such. So this is the most biologically plausible way on which our brains learn. Now, I'm going to talk about lifelong learning. As most of you have seen, AI has shown great potential in learning a vast set of problems. It's worked on language, it's worked on robotics, vision, and no matter what problem we seem to throw at it, it seems to do really well, and it's getting better. And in several fields, it has already exceeded human performance. What we notice is that even though AI excels at any particular task that we give it, whenever we give it more than one task, and by this I mean more than one task at a time, it tends to overwrite. It has inherent greedy ability to overwrite what it has learned in the past. Now, just to be clear, this does not mean that AI can't learn two tasks. It can. It's just how those tasks are presented to it, right? If these tasks are presented one after another, then it tends to prioritize the latest task. So what we notice is that in normal AI, if you have a particular task, it'll excel at it, as you can see in the red graph. But as you keep learning and training more tasks, that particular task's performance will keep dropping until it completely forgets it. So essentially, continual learning or lifelong learning is the ability to keep learning new tasks without forgetting old tasks, and preferably continue to also improve on those existing tasks, not only not forget, but also improve. So here's a quick example of what this looks like. So this is one of my training environments which I've developed. Just as an example, I've taken a few screen grabs from there. So I trained an AI to just find a parking spot and park in there. And it learned it no problem. This was using reinforcement learning, and it was able to do so in, I think, 120, not epochs, 120 training steps. Not training steps, actually, training cycles. Yeah, quite a few training steps in there. But when we taught it a second task, which was learning to merge into traffic, it learned that as well. It was great. It learned to merge almost immediately in even fewer number of training cycles. But when we tested it now on the parking, we noticed that there was some degradation in what it had learned, because what we noticed in the weights is those weights tend to move towards the latest data distribution. So if the latest data distribution preferred merging, then it tends to override what it did. And as we taught it more and more tasks, so now I taught it overlay, it got significantly worse at parking. And yeah, it just keeps getting worse. And honestly, at this point, you can think it's completely forgotten. So this problem is called catastrophic forgetting, where it is this ability of this, or this disability of this AI to actually learn, continually learn representations. So in addition to catastrophic forgetting, through this example, I'm also going to show you a few other key features of lifelong learning. So we have transfer and adaptation. And these are all features of our brain, the things that we do, that we take for granted, but AI really struggles with these things. So transfer and adaptation is the ability to transfer what you've learned from one task to another similar task, right? And we notice that AI is actually not really good at this. And when we do train it on the new task, it actually does not have that benefit of shared information between tasks. We need additional mechanisms for this. Then catastrophic forgetting, which I spoke about. Also exploiting task similarity. So this is very similar to adaptation, but over here we have different levels of similarity between tasks. And as the weights of a particular network fit to a particular task, there is some transition which takes place between either the nodes or the synapses. Last is task agnostic learning. Over here, when we have our AI, we always tell it that, hey, this is a task, this is a new task. You know, we tell it, we have a supervisory body telling it, hey, I'm going to change tasks. Whereas in the real world, we don't have anyone telling us something is changed. When I walk out this door, or if I walk onto the street, there's no one telling me that the task has changed, I have to cross. We need to be automatically aware of which task is going on. So that's task agnostic learning, not knowing when a task switches. And then there's obviously noise tolerance, which is the ability to work in noisy environments. And lastly, resource efficiency, because we are all computing with finite resources, whether it's a computer, an edge device, a robot, or even ourselves. And those resources can be on compute or memory, can be restricted on compute or memory. There are, as I highlighted from the brain diagram, there are quite a few mechanisms which contribute to solving this, such as neurogenesis for transfer and adaptation and task agnostic learning. Then we have episodic replay, which really helps with catastrophic forgetting and metaplasticity as well. Then we have neuromodulation, and you get the gist. There's quite a few different mechanisms, and they're not single purpose mechanisms. They do help across the board. Specifically to address catastrophic forgetting today, I'm going to introduce you to 3 types of mechanisms. One is called regularization-based approaches, which actually modulate the weights themselves or the synapses and allow you to actually transition the weight distribution so as to maximally prevent forgetting. You have dynamic architectures, which make structural changes in the networks. And then you also have replay mechanisms, which allow you to replay previous events and previous data so as to not forget what you've learned. Now, each of these does suffer from certain limitations. So we have regularization-based approaches. The problem with modulating your weights when the task changes is that, hey, you'll modulate it once, you'll get another task, you can accommodate 2, you'll modulate it again. But over time, this modulation does have adverse effects and prevents you from learning a very large number of tasks because it's a fixed capacity network. This is addressed through dynamic architectures. But as the network grows, the amount of memory and the compute and the complexity also grows. So that's a problem with dynamic architectures. And sorry, do you have a question? Okay, and lastly is the replay-based approaches, which have additional memory overheads for storing all that replay data. and also additional compute because you have to retrain on that. So none of them are a perfect way of solving this, but properly together, they can help reduce catastrophic forgetting. So what these mechanisms look like, we'll dive deeper. So the first mechanism talking about this is a method for regularization, which is exploring plasticity in the brain. So as you can see, where this is what the different synaptic mechanisms look like on a biological level. First, we'll talk about synaptic consolidation. So you have your synapses and they are learning information over time. As these neurotransmitters are shared between the neurons, these connections between the synapses grow and grow stronger over time. What we notice is that there are certain neurotransmitters which are responsible for immediate signals, and then some of them which are responsible for larger time signals, which takes place over larger time periods. And that can result in two different types of plasticity, which is short-term plasticity and long-term plasticity. And these initial learning changes that take place, which are for your current task, they help you with the short-term plasticity, whereas synaptic consolidation helps you to consolidate these memories or ideas that you have over very large periods of time. And this is one of our algorithms, which was ported or at least simulated on hardware, where we used memristors to actually bring out this ability of metaplasticity, where we not only control the plasticity of the neurons, but we control the plasticity of the plasticity. This allows us to essentially give a metaplastic term or a parameter to every neuron or every synapse, which controls its plasticity over time. Thereby, it essentially, think of it as an importance term, which assigns importance to a particular weight, telling it that it was important to a previous task, telling the neurons to preserve that weight while learning future tasks, thereby preventing that weight from being erased completely or modified to a large extent. The algorithm which was used to actually train this is the task force algorithm, where each neuron essentially comprises of two compartments. One is generally the membrane potential, and the second one actually stores a gradient for doing error-based random backpropagation, which is the learning algorithm, where we store the surrogate gradient, which is, you can think of it as it's not the same as a ANN gradient, which is an actual error derivative or a partial derivative. But this is more of an approximate gradient, which is computed from the time between the initial current between a current window. And we have these special modules which are responsible. I think the ones in light blue are for false positives and the ones of false negatives. This allows us to have error that can update based on those. So false positives are for updating neurons which spiked when they should not have spiked. No, that's false positives, which are neurons that spiked when they should not have spiked, and false negatives, which help updating the weights for the neurons which have not spiked when they should have spiked. And each neuron consists of a metaplastic term, which allows us to identify the importance, as I said. And the synaptic consolidation is done through a heterosynaptic decay, which forces all the weights towards a consolidated weight over time, thereby preventing them from branching out too far. Now, as I've said, this is a regularization-based approach, and it works really well when there are few tasks. And we've tested them, I think, for 4 or 5 tasks, which is not too many tasks, but it does well. Taking this forward, another approach for, I'm not going to talk too much about this, but another approach for regularization-based approaches was neuromodulation, where we actually simulate the different neuromodulators and the effects they can have. And I think we had one particular architecture called ModNet. This was under the DARPA L2M program, where we essentially use neuromodulators to modulate fixed connections. Oh, sorry, we have the initial layer, which is a fixed connection layer, which you think of it as a random projection layer, which is not trained. It produces essentially, you can think of it as a feature extraction or a feature projection into a higher dimensional space. And then that higher dimensional space is then correlated with the outputs using neuromodulation. To overcome the limitations of regularization-based approaches, which is fixed number of tasks or a small number of tasks, we have neuroevolution, which allows us to explore dynamic architectures or growing architectures. This is actually something that's actually viewed in our brain and is very dominant, as I said, in children or in a young phase of life, where a large amount of neuroevolution takes place and a growth of neurons and a large amount of connections between these neurons takes place in children, I think, in the first few months of development. And that's where they learn quite a bit of their interaction. So if there's any damage done to children in that, in that phase, it greatly affects them, and recovery from that is much harder. What these processes look like in an artificial neural network will be neurogenesis, which is basically us adding another node to our hidden layers. Obviously, we can't change the input layer or the output layer because those are tied to our senses or our outputs. Then we have synaptogenesis, which is connection of the actual edges between the nodes. You have neuron death, which is removal of nodes which are already existing, and synapse termination of synapse death. Now, let's look at an architecture where I've actually implemented neurogenesis in a real-time architecture. And you can see we have mechanisms for neurogenesis and pruning, which allows our network to grow not only horizontally, that means within layers, it also allows us to add new layers to incorporate high levels of information. And this is particularly difficult if you work with neural networks. Adding a new layer does not. So actually, I did have quite a bit of advice when I was developing this one. We had to have just, I think, all the weights connected to the next layer. Whenever we added a new layer of neurons, the forward weights would be 1, and then all the cross weights would be 0 to ensure that nothing changed just by adding an empty set of neurons. And then it takes it from there and grows these weights. So let's take a look at exactly how and when I add neurons. And so this is just a quick look at this was my master's thesis where I developed these rules. And I think I can take, I think there were quite a few rules, I think 12 different rules for different mechanisms. And let's take a look at a few of the rules which will help us actually grow our network. So one of the examples this is a very straightforward example. This is since I was using reinforcement learning to actually train these networks, we actually had a self-reward mechanism. So the agent was actually aware of the rewards that it was getting from the environment. And as it grew and it accumulated these rewards, we allowed the agent to actually keep track of these rewards over time. And we noticed that when the agent stopped learning, it had very few neurons, it could not learn more information, we actually noticed that the reward plateaued. So it's one of the easiest mechanisms that we can use for just self-growth, and then the agent itself developed the need for adding new neurons. Then a more nuanced approach towards finding where neurogenesis might be needed is by actually tracking the weights and the change in weights over time. So let's take any particular weight that we have in a network. If we actually track the change in the weight's magnitude or the change in the weight itself, not the magnitude, we actually notice that certain weights, when you're learning different tasks, start oscillating. That means those weights are being pulled in two different directions. That means you're trying to learn an opposing concept, and whatever the structure of the network is forcing that particular neuron to learn that concept. If the weights don't oscillate, that means that concept has been pushed or that information has been pushed to other parts of the network. But if that node keeps oscillating or that weight keeps oscillating, we notice that that node is under stress. So that's where we actually perform neurogenesis and introduce a new neuron to actually alleviate that particular tug of war that's taking place. And we need to actually not only track the change in the weight, but also the change in the absolute weight, because if you only track the change in the weight, if it oscillates around the 0 line, your summation would be 0. And that could either indicate no change in the weight or oscillation. So you won't know which one it is. So we actually track the change in the absolute as well. That allows us to account for this particular problem. So if there's a node which is just increasing that accounts for that particular problem, but we can't only track the change in the absolute, because if you have one node that keeps increasing by one, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that will also have a very large change in magnitude. So you need both these terms, and the difference between both these terms will actually tell you whether a weight is being pulled in opposite directions. Lastly, we have low margin of confidence. This is something that we use quite often. At the end, we have our softmax layer, or our essentially voltage. You can think of it, the membrane potential of the output, which tells us how close something was to spiking, or how confident a neuron was of its particular output. So obviously, there will be only one class which is usually selected at the out, but the difference between whoever was the maximum and its neighbors, that tells us quite a bit about how confident the network is about its prediction or its selection for a particular class. So if two classes, even though one will be the winner, we normally just take that as a win. But if the confidence level of another second class is close to it, we notice that there isn't enough difference between this. That means the network isn't absolutely confident that one particular output is selected over the other. That's where we can actually introduce new neurons to provide additional information to allow this confidence to be mitigated. I just wanted to also point out that when we're adding and growing these networks, it's very easy to lose track of the size of these networks. So as you keep adding networks, you'll be like, okay, we have like 50 neurons. For the next task, we can add another 50 neurons. And this quickly becomes untenable, because you will be growing your network and there's no pointers. You might as well have a different neural network learn the architecture. So it's very important to have pruning mechanisms also to actually remove some of these neurons. I won't go into all the pruning mechanisms today, but I just wanted to showcase that we tested it over a couple of different environments. And we noticed that when it shifts from task to task, having these neuron-aware mechanisms and exploiting that shared information between tasks, we can see that actually the amount of neurons added per task is actually reducing and going down. So that tells us that every new task is actually exploiting some of that shared information from the previous task as far as possible. And this is something that we hope, so that when you keep adding tasks, the network doesn't grow exponentially, but actually grows exponentially smaller. Lastly, I just wanted to showcase that starting when we actually initialize our networks, what I was doing in this algorithm was I actually initialized it with very small number of nodes, almost, I think, 3 or 4 nodes only. And I allowed it to grow all the way from the beginning till the end. And what we noticed was allowing it to start from an extremely small size, allow it to capture very small parts of information and grow only when needed. This actually not only allowed us to achieve state-of-the-art performance, but also allowed us to converge much quicker than some of the other comparative networks out there. So it's able to learn it the same environment just much faster, because it has fewer nodes to train over that time. And this was a fixed time experiment. So actually, instead of fixing the number of training steps, I fixed the number of amount of time that the network was given in the environment. So you can see the number of episodes kind of varying in this case. And this is just a quick look at an example of some of the environments that I was developing and using. So I took a small case scenario, which is a spider exploring its local habitats, gathering food and fighting with other spiders and so forth. And then I took a more realistic example of a forest fire and trapped some people in there and had some drones explore it. And I will come back to this in a future slide, but I just want to give you an example of what the tasks are. So this is within an environment, and these are different tasks. So it could be exploring the environment can be task 1, finding people can be task 2, leading them out to safety can be task 3, and working with other drones can be task 4. Okay, so now that I've introduced you to exactly what tasks are, I'd like to talk about other approaches, more recent approaches that I've been looking into for growing these neural networks. So you have task networks, which essentially learn any one example task. And you can train a second task network to learn another task. What I was thinking was we can use something called a hypernetwork, which is a specialized neural network that learns the weights of a particular task network. So now we can actually learn independent tasks on independent networks and completely sidestep the overlapping or catastrophic forgetting problem that happens, and actually have a hypernetwork and incorporate the weights of these networks as they come in. Okay, and this actually helps us learn significantly larger number of tasks as the number of tasks grow. So what that would look like is you'd have your task ID provided as input, as well as the layer weights. So we could actually, your input for your hypernetwork could be equal to the total number of synapses. It could be equal to the total number of nodes, or it could just be one input where you're feeding in, one node at a time or one synapse at a time. And we noticed that the best way is to have the input size for the hypernetwork be the same size as the number of neurons in a particular layer. So you'll be taking input as the task ID and the particular layer number, in addition to you'll be taking those inputs, and the outputs would be the weights of that entire layer, essentially. And this was a good balance between network size and performance, and also training time. Now, hypernetworks have been done before, but what I noticed was, okay, you have a hypernetwork, it'll learn 5 tasks, but what happens when you have the 6 tasks? Now, after a while, your hypernetwork is also going to undergo catastrophic forgetting as you increase the number of networks. So this was my PhD thesis, where I introduced a cascading hypernetworks architecture, where we not only have a hypernetwork generate its own children or child networks, but the hypernetwork also generates, can also learn the weights of other hypernetworks, and in turn generate the weights of other hypernetworks. And normally you think it grows downwards, but actually this hierarchy is growing upwards. Now, there's no biologically plausible system which can explain some of this, but this was work which really helped us get past the limitations of some of the fixed size networks and also ever-growing networks. So we noticed that even though it seems like a very large hierarchy, you only need one particular hypernetwork to exist at any one particular time. You can delete the other networks as they're generated. So you only need 2 networks worth of memory to store, and you can store a very large set of tasks or task networks in this hierarchy. This shows 3 levels, but the hierarchy can be considerably higher. And I also want to show that this was tested on, because I eventually did run out of reinforcement learning environments to test this on. So I tested it on data sets where I was giving them classification, where each here it's, I think, Cypher 100, and each one is, there are 50 tasks, and each one is, I think, binary classification. And then I also did ImageNet, where I did 20 tasks, but that's 10 class classification. So I wanted to test against data complexity and number of tasks as well. And the network does really well and performs really well for more number of tasks. That's what the algorithm is suitable for. Now, there are overheads. This thing is substantially slower because slower in the sense that it takes longer for you to generate the task network and then get to the actual solving problem. So the overhead is actually latency in task switching. So this is better for slow switching tasks rather than fast switching tasks. We also test this on reinforcement learning benchmarks, the Mujoko environments, to see if it could do, and it did significantly well and was able to learn with minimal forgetting. Yes.
Yeah. Like, how does the number of parameters grow as you go to higher levels of?
Okay, so what we did was we had your original network. You can think of it as the number of parameters is X, right? So we did try different variations of the hypernetwork and how many additional parameters it needs to actually encompass it. So our goal was to keep it below 2 times. And we also varied the number of networks that can be learned by one particular hypernetwork. So basically the number of children you have at every stage. And we varied that between, I think, 5 to 15. So there are some interesting dynamics over there. As you grow the network horizontally, it can actually encompass more, more networks per hypernetwork. So I think 5 was the best, but as you increase, it does go down after 5. I think till 5 children per hypernetwork, it was very comfortable. Beyond that, the tasks start to degrade. And as I said, the hypernetwork size is about 1.5 times the previous child. Basically,
It goes exponential.
Yes, it does grow exponentially. Yeah, I guess it would be a cumulative growth because it's 1.5 times its child. So yes, if you're thinking of hardware, you would need to set a maximum size for your highest level in the hierarchy or a predefined size for the maximum in the hierarchy. But the benefit is that you don't have to store all the other networks. You only need 2 of this network of the largest size required. And like you just store your root network, which is the highest level, and it would generate a child. Then that would generate a task network, and then you could delete the parent network in the middle. So long as you preserve the root network and the final child, you only need 2 spots in memory, or 3 spots, one temporary spot. Okay, and the third method for mitigating catastrophic forgetting through neuromorphic architectures is replay. Now, replay is actually there are different types of replay. One is replay during sleep. This is a specialized replay. We all sleep, and I don't know if you've noticed, but this is something I've noticed that if I sleep well, I actually do better the next day. And if I cram for an exam and I don't sleep that day, I've noticed that actually somehow I actually do worse. So it may be due to this, maybe something else, but what I noticed is that while we're sleeping, we notice that some of these neuron patterns, the firing patterns, are actually replayed at an accelerated rate or a compressed, what is known as a compressed replay. So we are actually dreaming these events at a much faster scale than we actually experience them. This is more efficient and also allows us to replay those experiences in an inactive phase. Now, none of our AI have downtime, so we keep them running all the time. But this replay mechanism, if introduced, can help us mitigate catastrophic forgetting. And this is the most effective method because you can think of it as kind of like cheating because you are replaying those samples. It's like retraining, essentially. But we've got creative with how we store and produce this replay. So this replay is inspired by the hippocampus where this activity takes place. And allowing us to play these memories not only prevents forgetting, but also allows us to consolidate what we've learned over longer periods of time. So long-term memories. And what we do is when we implement this in, say, a spiking neural network, we don't have to always store the entire data sample as it came in. We can actually store the spikes at any particular network that we have, at any particular stage in the network. So we don't have to actually store the input data, which can be quite large, but we can actually store those spike representations. Additionally, there are other methods where we don't have to store the data at all. We can actually regenerate those input samples using a generative replay-based mechanism. So you can have, in traditional ANNs, we use a autoencoder to replay some of those samples. So they'll convert those input samples into a latent space and then replay them by regenerating them. They also allow us to replay fewer samples than the original data set because those latent space representations are a more homogeneous representation of the class rather than a particular specific sample. And that's what we want. Additionally, you can also use a reservoir to actually encode this information. And a reservoir is less of a latent space and more of a higher dimensional space. And this allows us to actually replay samples which are different from the input samples. And this can actually reduce the amount of energy required while doing spiking replay. The last part is when I was doing my mechanism, I actually lucked into something. This is something called auto-generative replay, what I'm calling auto-generative replay. Since I was working with hypernetworks, I realized that I don't need a separate network or a reservoir to generate it. I already have my hypernetwork, which can generate previous samples. So when I'm learning new samples of new networks, I can actually replay those automatically from the hypernetwork. Now, this is a bit of compute overhead, but actually reduces our space requirements. I no longer need a very large buffer to store all those samples. And we have varied the amount of buffer that's replayed. And lastly, I just want to talk about the size of these buffers. So when you compare it against traditional neural networks and that use replay, so like GEM, or dark experience replay, we actually noticed that this architecture uses significantly less memory, and that's on a log scale, actually. Okay, I just want to give a quick look into neuromorphic hardware. So there are different stages of development. So when we take inspiration from the brain, you can look at synapse and neuron level processes. You can look at network level processes, and then those networks can be abstracted into hardware-based equivalents. And then we actually come to the designing and layouts of these chips. And it's very efficient and very important for you to design these networks, co-design these networks with the hardware, because it's very important to keep in mind the hardware constraints and also the hardware parameters. So this is something I was talking with at the ENS lab, and I think they've been working on this significantly more than I have. So I'm not the hardware person, but I will be showcasing some of our accelerators that we've developed in our lab. So this was an example of just a traditional AI accelerator, which used a new kind of mathematical new kind of data format for the representation of your weights and your activations. So instead of using 4 floating point or fixed point representations, we actually use something called POSIT, which is a new type of representation, which is actually very good for neural networks in general. This is in contrast with a digital neuromorphic accelerator, which actually operates on spikes. So even though the architecture looks more or less the same, there are additional overhead mechanisms that you need to incorporate, such as encoders and decoders for the spikes. You will need optimized versions of your activation functions, which are quite hard to do in limited hardware because they need exponential functions. So we kind of use reduced representations of these equations or approximations of these equations. In addition, I think there were other optimizations which take place, like when we do digital spikes, we actually used AER format, which is address event representations. So instead of actually storing the whole spike train, like ones and zeros, you can actually only store the address of that particular spike or the particular neuron that spiked at a particular time step. So it actually reduces the amount of information that needs to be passed from neuron to neuron. Lastly, there's also memory organization, which takes place. So you can optimize this by reducing the precision of your weights and activations and also store them together in pairs. So for example, when we had metaplasticity, we stored our metaplasticity factors and our synaptic consolidation factors together, made fetching them a little easier. And this was, I think, the die that was built. It was built on IBM 65 nanometer technology. And we were able to get the power down to 17 milliwatts for classifying one image in the MNIST data set. And just to highlight that this was a lifelong learning chip, so it was able to learn multiple tasks using the metaplasticity architecture. We also had, I don't know if this was the one with the memristors on it, but we had a separate section of this which worked with the analog side as well. I also want to do a quick case study on the analog side, not just the digital neuromorphic side. So as we're all familiar with some of the basic components in electronics, which is resistors, capacitors, inductors, there's the fourth one, which is memristors, which we didn't really get to play around with in our labs because they are still a new technology, which is making it to the markets. But a memristor is one of those 4 fundamental passive electrical components, which actually combines a resistor and a capacitor. Or you can think of it as a variable resistor, which allows you to basically store a resistance value and modify that value by passing current or voltage through it. So I think the ENS lab will give you a much better deep dive into memristors and how they work. So I'll just give you an example of a 6-bit parallel multiplier and what it looks like in digital hardware. And each of those components, the full adders and half adders, have quite a bit of circuitry behind that as well. This is what it looks like for just performing a single multiplication. But you can actually do these multiplication operations in the analog space, which considerably less electronic circuitry. So this is a look at what a memristor crossbar would look like, where you have your rows where your inputs are coming from and your columns where your output is accumulated. And these memristor crossbars essentially perform a vector matrix multiplication operation by taking your inputs and multiplying it by the weights using your simple current into resistance formula. And then these currents are then summed using a summing amplifier, I believe. And then that essentially performs one of the most common operations in AI, which is multiply and accumulate. I also wanted to showcase that what you saw on the left was a single multiplication, whereas in analog hardware, with these memristor crossbars, that would perform not just one multiplication, but an entire matrix of multiplications and accumulations. There are also, and you'd be concerned about the size of these neuromorphic devices, like memristors. And what we've seen is that people have been able to reduce the size over time. And this is still an ongoing field. There are still several drawbacks of memristors. I won't say it's a very stable technology. There's drift, and also there are some leakage paths which take place. So you need additional gating mechanisms. And you also have the number of operations which can take place on a memristor. Sometimes the number of cycles a memristor can train on is limited. So it starts degrading over time as well. But you can see that you can actually condense these down to very efficient sizes on digital hardware. On layout. The last thing is just a recap of the digital flow that you can approach neuromorphic computing from both a digital side and an analog side when designing chips. And you have many architectures today which are mixed signal architectures. So there are several applications of neuromorphic computing. Do I have to stop?
A few more minutes.
5 minutes. Okay, I'm going to race through them. So I just want to quickly showcase that neuromorphic applications are not only limited to traditional AI applications, but they have some special areas as well. So since they work on spike-based representations and sparse events, we can actually, rather than using normal RGB cameras, we can actually use event cameras, which Sony is really diving into right now. So event cameras, instead of showing the entire frame, only showcase the change between a particular frame. And you'd say, hey, we can do that in software through frame subtraction, but actually that's additional hardware and additional processing that you need to do on every frame. Whereas event cameras directly do this from a hardware level and only pass out the spikes or the pixels which have changed from one frame to another. This is really great because you no longer have to pass the entire millions of pixels at one time. You can only pass those specific events, thereby reducing the amount of data you get and also the amount of data that needs to be processed by your network. So this becomes very efficient for very high performance and high speed applications, such as tracking the wings of a fly or even a swing of a golf club, which is very good in high speed applications. And I believe that Mercedes-Benz is the first company to actually incorporate them that I know of in actual cars. And this is technically their concept car, but they are putting a neuromorphic sensor in there for high speed tracking of obstacles. Wanted to showcase some of the environments. We have tried to upgrade these environments because this is not something you can train on in real life. So been trying to, but then I actually had a look at a real forest fire and it looked much worse than my simulation. Yeah. So I need to still work on these. We have additional environments for very hazardous environments where neuromorphic computing can really stand out because it's more robust and spikes are inherently more noise tolerant. So we're actually exploring radiation-based environments like space and more hazardous environments under a couple of different programs. So hopefully we'll be able to develop environments and simulate some of those. And also we wanted to showcase that lifelong learning, some of the applications of lifelong learning could not only to real-time applications, but also in applications such as detecting strains for something like COVID-19, where, hey, you train your whole network to detect the strain or develop an antibody, but then you get a new strain and you have to train this all over from scratch. And training networks today costs millions of dollars. So the importance of lifelong learning really stands in being able to train on only the new data that came in, rather than training on all the previous data again from scratch. So as you've seen, neuromorphic computing has grown significantly over the last few years, and there are new architectures and new chips out there. And the scale of these chips have grown significantly. And today we have chips like Loihi 2 and Spinnaker, which have crossed 1 billion neurons. And not per chip, but this is 1 billion neurons aggregated over boards. They've put together large-scale systems. And there are several features which make this a very important, a very enterprising and very lucrative choice for different industries, such as the sparse computing, energy efficiency, scalability, asynchronous nature of processing, distributed and hierarchical nature. That means you can connect different networks once they have the same kind of format, heterogeneous computing, and reconfigurable computing. There are several case studies of parts of the neuromorphic computing ecosystem which are missing as compared to traditional AI. So there are different frameworks which are there in AI which we use day-to-day, like TensorRT, but we don't have equivalents for them in neuromorphic space. This is a call to action for people to actually develop these components and develop tool chains which can compile to different targets as well. And since there's this lack of not only neuromorphic different software tool chains, but also neuromorphic hardware, we can't actually buy most of this hardware today in any consumer place. And it's very restricted. You can buy a few memdistors maybe, but we need a wider dissemination of this because it also encourages more students to look into it and more researchers to get into the field. That brings me to my organization, which is Thor and the Thor project. This is a neuromorphic commons, which is actually trying to develop and host open access, large scale neuromorphic computing resources for everyone, so that you guys can get access to the hardware. So this is hardware that has been collected from different high-end neuromorphic systems, which I won't talk about today, but we're going to launch in a week, and you guys will send out an email to everyone who's interested. And we'll be having cutting-edge open source platforms, collaborative community challenges, competitive challenges, and standardized benchmarks as well. And it's a partnership between many universities, and all the hardware is hosted locally. And this is completely free. So we're hoping to give researchers and students an ability to access this hardware to test their algorithms. Thank you so much for attending the talk. And please use the QR code if you're interested in our project and if you'd like to get access to these systems.
Great.
I know I'm way over time, but I would also like to acknowledge the different funding agencies, namely NSF, DARPA, the AFRL, as well as my institution, the Matrix AI Consortium, UT Senate. As well as my lab, a lot of this work has been that I showcased. Some of it was mine, but a lot of this was from my lab students and also my advisor, Dr. Divisha Kurithipuri, who is now my boss and the founder of the New AI Lab. Thank you so much.
So time for a couple of questions. Thank you. Real quick, if we want. And then I think there's time afterwards.
Sure.
You can ask later.
I'll make this really quick. How's the funding for the NSF going?
Oh, yeah. Well, the good news is actually, really good news is that a large part of the funding, at least some of it, was actually, we got some of that funding from an initial phase. So we're actually good to go. And we actually used it to acquire, we're in partnership with several neuromorphic companies, industrial partners. And we've actually managed to acquire our first large-scale neuromorphic system, which we will announce next week. I'm sorry, I could not include the slides. I had to remove the slide, actually. We had to launch about a week ago, but we were just in the development phase. And also there was, I think the NSF is off right now. So we have a meeting scheduled with them also to go over the next phase. But yeah, NSF, it's tough, but actually they've been really supportive of the project and they showed renewed interest in the neuromorphic space. So that's a really good sign.
It's good that that's still going.
Yeah. Actually, just a few weeks back, we met with the program manager at the SAIL AI conference for AI institutes, and it went really well. Yeah.
So kind of a huge question, but I think maybe if you could give us a kind of a quick overview of the compiler pipeline to get from the
right. So as of right now, from a user standpoint, the thing is extremely distributed. So all the tool chains are kind of developed in-house by either the research teams that develop them in case they're from an research institute, or by the company that made them. Like, for example, Intel maintains the Lava framework with their Magma toolchain for internal low-level code. Spinnaker, which is based in Germany, they have their PySpinnaker-based platforms. But the problem is that all their compilers are all specific, hardware specific, only for the target hardware. So we're trying to encourage the development of an intermediate format. I think there is an NIR format, which is like a neuron exchange format.
Okay.
But that essentially just is, it describes your hardware. It doesn't actually help you compile to it.
Okay.
And I believe there is a very good effort from Sandia National Labs called the Fugu system. They're trying to build this platform which has bricks that actually compile to different multiple backends. So far I've seen, I think they compile to about 3 or 4 different backends. So that's just a good sign. But even them, they still need help from the toolchain partners to actually develop those backends. So yeah.
Thank you.
Yes.
Just maybe a follow on, in the context of neuromorphic computing, one might wonder whether or not we need a compiler
Okay,
at all.
fair enough.
And so I think there's a whole class of compute emerging, neuromorphic, that is free from compilers, or certainly anything like CUDA. We ask ourselves, is there a central compiler here? And it seems fundamentally implausible that
So
there
it's
would
just
be.
like behavior is entirely just depends on the input it
Data
receives.
driven
Yeah,
from input to output.
Cool.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
Oh, definitely. So I agree with him. So the need for a compiler is only because some of these hardwares have restrictions, right? And the goal of the hardware is, at the moment at least, it's not for deployment phase, it's for research phase. So researchers want that flexibility in being able to change the microcode or the operations or the nature of operations. So I think Lohi has these processors in there where you can actually customize the learning rule by changing some of the microcode inside. But definitely some of the analog-based systems that I'm familiar with, like brain scales, I think they don't need a compiler, they only have a data format which you need to follow. There's no actual compiler. I'm not entirely sure, but I think so, yeah.
So that would be, just so I'm clear on it, be kind of like a heterogeneous system where you might have a compiler that handles the data preparation that then gets handed off to the processor.
Sure, you can just prepare the data in that format, yeah.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much.